Upon hearing a truck driver whistling a song, the millionaire froze when he heard it. It was the same song his beloved used to whistle before she disappeared 21 years ago. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt as Richard Halbrook pulled his silver Mercedes into the dusty parking lot of Murphy's Gas and Go. At 52, he cut an imposing figure even in the middle of nowhere. Tailored suit wrinkled from the long drive. Salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled, but those steel gray eyes still sharp as a hawk's. He'd been driving for 3 hours straight, chasing another real estate deal that would probably net him millions he didn't need. 21 years in this business, and he still couldn't sit still, couldn't stop moving, because when you stop, the ghosts catch up. The bell above the gas station door chimed as he stepped inside, the air conditioning hitting him like a blessing. Behind the counter, an elderly man with weathered hands looked up from his newspaper. "Afternoon, mister. Hot one today, ain't it?" "Sure is," Richard replied, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler. The familiar routine of small talk, of pretending everything was normal. He'd perfected it over the years. That's when he heard it. The sound drifted through the open door, a soft, melodic whistling that made his blood turn to ice. The bottle slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a plastic thud that echoed through the small store. Southern skies, take me home. The melody was hauntingly familiar, but it wasn't just the song. It was the way it was being whistled. The same delicate pause after southern, the slight trill on skies, the way the notes seemed to dance on the air, exactly the way Emily used to whistle it during her pregnancy, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she hummed to their unborn daughter. "You all right there, son?" The clerk's voice seemed to come from miles away. Richard's legs felt like lead as he stumbled toward the door. Outside, a young woman was walking around a massive 18-wheeler, checking the straps on her cargo. She couldn't have been more than 20, with sun-kissed brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing faded jeans that had seen better days. Her movements were confident, purposeful, someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and she was still whistling that impossible melody. "Emily," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer. The young woman looked up, her green eyes meeting his across the parking lot. For a moment, time stood still. Those eyes, they were Emily's eyes, the same shade of emerald that had haunted his dreams for 21 years. "You need something, mister." Her voice was strong, with just a hint of Texas drawl. Nothing like Emily's soft musical tone, but there was something. "That song," Richard said, his voice rough. "Where did you learn it?" She tilted her head, studying him with curious suspicion. "Southern skies. My grandma used to sing it." "Why?" "Grandma, of course." Richard's mind raced, trying to make sense of what couldn't possibly make sense. I knew someone who used to sing it the same way. Lot of people know that song." She turned back to her truck, dismissing him. "It's a classic." But it wasn't just any version. It was Emily's version. With all her little quirks and personal touches, Richard watched as the young woman, Grace, according to the name embroidered on her work shirt, continued her pre-trip inspection. Every movement was efficient, practiced. This wasn't some spoiled rich kid playing dress-up. This was someone who'd earned every callus on those capable hands. A younger man emerged from the garage bay, wiping grease from his fingers with a red rag. He was maybe 25, with dark hair and honest brown eyes that lit up when he saw Grace. "Hey, Gracie, truck running smooth." "Like a dream, Jake. Thanks for tuning her up." Grace's whole demeanor softened when she looked at him. "You sure you don't want me to pay you this time? Your money's no good here, and you know it." Jake's smile was warm, genuine, the kind of smile that said he'd do anything for this woman and never ask for a thing in return. Richard felt like he was watching a movie, disconnected from reality. This couldn't be happening. Emily was dead. Their daughter was dead. He'd seen the reports, signed the papers, buried empty dreams 21 years ago. October 15th, 2003. The date was burned into his memory like a brand. The phone call that shattered his world. "Mr. Halbrook, there's been an accident." Emily had been driving to her mother's house, nervous about being so close to her due date, but wanting to spend time with her mom before the baby came. She'd been singing. The paramedics said they found her still humming when they pulled her from the wreckage. By the time Richard reached the hospital, it was over. Emily was gone. And their daughter, their beautiful daughter, had died from her injuries 3 hours after birth. Victor Densmore, his business partner and closest friend, had held him as he sobbed in that sterile hospital corridor. Victor had handled everything: the paperwork, the arrangements, even the brief funeral that Richard barely remembered through his haze of grief. "You coming or going?" Grace's voice snapped him back to the present. Richard realized he'd been staring at her for God knows how long. "I'm sorry, I was just... Look, mister, I don't know what your deal is, but I've got a delivery to make before sunset." She climbed into the cab of her truck with practiced ease. "Jake, I'll see you next week. Drive safe, Gracie. Call me when you get there." The engine roared to life, and Richard watched helplessly as the truck pulled out of the parking lot, taking that impossible melody with it. He stood there long after the dust had settled, his mind reeling, back inside the gas station. The clerk was mopping up the spilled water. "That's Grace Linwood," he said without being asked. "Good girl. Been driving these routes since she turned 18. Takes care of her grandma Martha out on Cedar Creek Road." "Martha?" Richard's pulse quickened. "Martha Linwood, nice lady. Bit of a hermit, though. Used to be a nurse, I think. They keep to themselves mostly. But Grace helps out half the folks in 3 counties. Hauls supplies to places the big companies won't bother with." Richard paid for his water with shaking hands. Cedar Creek Road. He had a name, a location. It was more than he'd had 5 minutes ago. As he drove away from the gas station, his phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa Corbin, his secretary, and whatever they were. How did the Henderson meeting go? Dinner when you get back? He ignored it. For the first time in 21 years, business was the last thing on his mind. That night, in his hotel room in the nearest town, Richard sat on the edge of the bed and did something he hadn't done since Emily died. He tried to whistle. Southern Skies. The melody came out broken, painful, nothing like the pure, sweet sound that had stopped his world earlier that day. Somewhere out there, a young woman who looked like his dead wife was living a life he knew nothing about. A woman who whistled Emily's song with Emily's exact inflections, who had Emily's eyes and carried herself with a strength that Emily would have admired. It was impossible. It was insane. But Richard Halbrook hadn't built an empire by ignoring possibilities, no matter how remote. Tomorrow, he would start asking questions. Tomorrow, he would begin a search that would either heal his broken heart or destroy what was left of his sanity. Outside his window, the Texas night was full of stars and secrets, and somewhere under that vast sky, Grace Linwood was probably whistling that haunting melody, never knowing that each note was calling a lost father home. The next morning found Richard parked outside a small diner in Cedar Creek, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and pretending to read the local newspaper. In reality, he was studying every vehicle that passed, hoping to catch another glimpse of that 18-wheeler and its mysterious driver. His phone had been buzzing nonstop since dawn. Vanessa, Brandon, business associates, the whole world demanding his attention, while his mind remained fixated on impossibilities and haunting melodies. "You're not eating." The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, refilled his cup. "Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, you know." "I'm not really hungry." Richard managed a weak smile. "Say you wouldn't happen to know a young woman named Grace Linwood, would you? Drives a big truck." The waitress's expression warmed immediately. "Gracie. Course I know her, sweet girl. That one. Takes after her grandma Martha. Always helping folks who need it. Just last month she hauled supplies to the Rodriguez family when their boy got sick. Wouldn't take a dime for it either." "What about her family? Her parents?" "Never knew them. Martha raised her from when she was just a baby. Tragic story, really. Martha always said Gracie's mama died young, and her daddy, well, Martha never had much good to say about rich men abandoning their responsibilities." Rich men? The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He gripped his coffee cup tighter, trying to process what he'd just heard. Did Martha ever say anything specific about Grace's father? The waitress shrugged. Just that he was one of those wealthy types who thought money could buy their way out of anything. Left Gracie's mama high and dry, according to Martha. But that's all ancient history now. Ancient history. 21 years ancient. Richard's phone rang, and Brandon's name flashed on the screen. He let it go to voicemail, but it rang again immediately. "I should take this," he told the waitress, stepping outside into the morning heat. "Dad, finally, where the hell are you?" Brandon's voice carried that familiar edge of irritation mixed with concern. Vanessa's been calling me all morning. You missed the Henderson meeting, and you've got the Morrison signing this afternoon. Richard closed his eyes. Brandon, his 35-year-old son who'd grown up feeling like an afterthought, raised more by nannies and boarding schools than by his grieving father. After Emily died, Richard had thrown himself into work, leaving Brandon to figure out life on his own. The result was a playboy who drifted from woman to woman, job to job, never quite finding his place in the world. I'm in Texas. Something came up. Texas. What kind of business takes you to the middle of nowhere without telling anyone? It's complicated. Richard watched a dust devil dance across the empty street. Can you handle the Morrison deal? Me? Brandon's surprise was evident. Dad, I haven't been actively involved in the company for years. You made it pretty clear you didn't need my help. The accusation stung because it was true. After Emily died, Richard had shut everyone out, including his own son. I'm asking for your help now. A long pause. What's really going on? This isn't like you, Richard wanted to tell him. Wanted to share the impossible hope that was blooming in his chest like a flower growing through concrete. But how do you explain that you think you found your dead daughter alive and well, driving trucks through rural Texas? I'll call you tonight, he said instead. Handle Morrison for me. Dad? Richard hung up and immediately felt guilty. Brandon deserved better. He'd always deserved better. Back at his hotel, Richard opened his laptop and did what he did best: research. Within an hour, he'd learned that Martha Linwood was 68 years old, a retired nurse who'd worked at Dallas Presbyterian Hospital for over 30 years before moving to Cedar Creek in 2004. She owned a small house on 12 acres, grew herbs, and kept to herself. The timeline fit perfectly. Too perfectly. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, Grace was having her own difficult morning. Martha had been up all night again, pacing the house and muttering about old secrets. At 70, her grandmother was still sharp as a tack, but lately she'd been different, worried about things she wouldn't discuss. Grandma, you need to eat something. Grace set a plate of eggs and toast on the kitchen table. The house smelled like the medicinal herbs Martha grew in her garden. Lavender, chamomile, and others Grace couldn't identify. I'm not hungry, child. Martha stood at the window, her weathered hands gripping the curtain. Did you notice anyone following you yesterday? Anyone asking questions? No more than usual. Why? Martha turned, and Grace was struck by how fragile she looked in the morning light. This woman who'd raised her, who'd been strong enough to handle any crisis, suddenly seemed breakable. There are things, Gracie, things I should have told you long ago. Martha's voice was barely above a whisper. About your mama, about why we live the way we do. Grace felt that familiar knot in her stomach, growing up. She'd asked countless questions about her parents, only to be told that some stories were too painful to share. Her mother had died young, abandoned by a wealthy man who cared more about his reputation than his responsibilities. That's all Martha had ever been willing to say. You always said she died in an accident. She did. Martha's eyes filled with tears. But it wasn't the kind of accident you think, and you... Oh, sweet child, you were never supposed to survive it. What are you talking about? But Martha had already turned away, disappearing into her bedroom, and leaving Grace with more questions than answers. That afternoon, Grace was loading supplies for the Henderson ranch when Jake appeared at her truck. You okay? You seem rattled. She looked at Jake, really looked at him. They'd known each other since childhood. When he was the shy kid who helped Martha fix her broken fence, and she was the tomboy who preferred engines to dolls, he'd grown into a good man, honest and hardworking, with hands that could fix anything, and a heart big enough to forgive the world its flaws. Martha's acting strange, talking about secrets and my mother. I don't know what to think. Jake leaned against the truck. Maybe it's time you knew the truth. What truth? Do you know something I don't? I know Martha's been carrying something heavy for a long time, and I know that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. Before Grace could ask what he meant, Jake's expression shifted. Speaking of which, there was a guy here yesterday asking about you. Older, expensive suit, driving a Mercedes, seemed real interested in that song you were whistling. What song? Southern Skies, the one Martha taught you. Grace felt a chill despite the Texas heat. What did you tell him? Nothing much, but Gracie, "Be careful. I don't like the feel of this." As Grace drove toward the Henderson ranch, she found herself thinking about the stranger with the expensive suit. She'd noticed him watching her at the gas station, had seen something in his eyes that looked like recognition, but that was impossible. She'd never seen him before in her life, or had she, that evening? As the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and crimson, Grace sat on Martha's porch and unconsciously began whistling Southern Skies. The melody drifted across the fields, carrying with it the weight of 21 years of secrets. Somewhere in town, Richard Halbrook was making plans to drive out to Cedar Creek Road tomorrow. He would find answers, one way or another. And in her bedroom, Martha Linwood was pulling a small wooden box from beneath her bed, a box she'd kept hidden for over 2 decades. Inside were letters written in a careful hand, a hospital bracelet that read, "Baby Girl Halbrook," and a photograph of a young woman with green eyes and a radiant smile. The past was stirring, like dust in the wind. And Martha knew that some storms couldn't be weathered twice. Richard's hands were steady on the steering wheel as he drove down Cedar Creek Road, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. He'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times, crafting a story about needing transport for construction materials to a remote site. It was thin, but it would have to do. The Linwood property sat at the end of a gravel drive. Surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon, the house was modest but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. Herbs and wildflowers grew in careful abundance. Filling the air with scents of lavender and rosemary, Grace's truck wasn't in the driveway. An older woman emerged from the house as Richard parked. Martha Linwood moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades on her feet in hospital corridors. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied him with obvious suspicion. "Can I help you?" Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. "I'm looking for Grace Linwood. I have a job that might interest her." Richard stepped out of his car, trying to project casual confidence. "Transportation work." Martha's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Fear, recognition. "Grace isn't here." "Who's asking?" "Richard Halbrook." He extended his hand, watching carefully for any reaction. Martha's face went white as bone. For a moment, she swayed on her feet, gripping the porch railing for support. The reaction was so immediate, so visceral, that Richard knew with absolute certainty that this woman knew exactly who he was. "You?" she whispered. "After all these years. Mrs. Linwood, are you all right? You need to leave." Martha's voice was steady now, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the rail. "Right now, before she comes back. Please, I just want to talk to Grace. About the job." "There is no job." Martha stepped closer, and Richard was surprised by the fierce protectiveness in her voice. "I know who you are. Richard Halbrook. I know what you did, and I'll be damned if I let you hurt that girl the way you hurt her mother." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "Her mother, you mean?" "Don't." Martha held up a hand. "Don't you dare play innocent with me. Emily Halbrook died because of your business partner's greed, and you let him cover it up. You let the world think it was just an accident." Richard's mind reeled. "How do you know about Emily? How do you know about Victor?" Martha's laugh was bitter. "I was the night shift supervisor at Dallas Presbyterian. I was there when they brought her in. I was there when—" She stopped, her hand going to her throat as if the words were choking her. "When what?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. But before Martha could answer, the sound of an approaching diesel engine filled the air. Grace's truck appeared at the end of the drive, and Martha's expression shifted to pure panic. "You have to go now. She can't see you here. Mrs. Linwood, please." "I said go." Richard retreated to his car, but instead of leaving, he pulled over just out of sight down the road. His hands shook as he called up old newspaper archives on his phone, searching for anything about the hospital staff on duty the night Emily died. There it was. Supervising Nurse Martha Linwood reported that all protocols were followed during the emergency response. Martha had been there. She'd been there when Emily died. When their daughter... His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Murphy's gas station. 1 hour. Come alone or don't come at all. M. Linwood. The next hour crawled by like molasses. Richard sat in the gas station parking lot, watching dust devils dance across the empty lot and trying to prepare himself for whatever truth Martha was about to reveal. She arrived precisely on time, driving an old pickup truck with careful, practiced movements. Up close, Richard could see the weight she carried, 21 years of secrets etched in the lines around her eyes. "You want to know about that night?" she said without preamble. "About what really happened. More than anything." Martha stared out at the horizon for a long moment. Emily was 8.5 months pregnant when they brought her in. Car accident, they said. Single vehicle, lost control on a wet road. She paused. But there was nothing single vehicle about what I saw. Richard's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" "The damage patterns were all wrong. I'd seen enough accident victims to know. Someone had rammed her car, forced her off the road. And Emily, she was conscious when they brought her in. Barely, but conscious. She lived, for about 20 minutes. Long enough to tell me who did this to her." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Victor Densmore. She said he'd discovered she had documents proving his embezzlement. Said he'd threatened her. Told her accidents could happen to anyone. The world seemed to tilt sideways. That's impossible. Victor was my friend. He helped me through everything after he murdered your wife to protect his own skin." Martha's voice was hard as granite. "Emily knew she was dying. Used her last breath to make me promise something." "What?" "To save her baby. To protect that child from the man who'd killed her mother." Richard couldn't breathe. "The baby died. I saw the death certificate." Martha's smile was sad and complex. "Death certificates can be adjusted when you know the right people and have the right motivation. Emily's daughter was born alive. Richard, premature, but strong. Fighter, just like her mama." The implication hit Richard like a freight train. "Grace. Emily named her before she died. Said if it was a girl, she wanted her called Grace. Said it meant God's blessing, and that child would need all the blessings she could get." Richard's vision blurred. 21 years. 21 years of believing his daughter was dead while she grew up 50 miles away, raised by a woman who'd risked everything to protect her. "Why?" he managed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Martha's expression hardened. "Because Victor Densmore was your business partner, your friend. Because you mourned Emily for about 6 months before you started showing up at charity events with other women. Because I couldn't risk that little girl's life on the chance that you might actually care more about her than your reputation." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Richard had thrown himself into work after Emily's death, had dated casually when the loneliness became unbearable, but he'd never stopped loving Emily, never stopped grieving their lost daughter. "I would have protected her. Would you? When Victor was right there beside you, helping plan Emily's funeral, when he had access to your life, your business, your every move?" Martha shook her head. "I couldn't take that chance. So I falsified the records, made it look like the baby died from her injuries, and I disappeared. With my daughter, with Emily's daughter, I raised her to be strong, independent, to trust her own instincts. I raised her to survive in a world that chews up and spits out anyone who can't protect themselves." Richard thought about Grace, her confident movements, her suspicion of wealth, her obvious independence. "She hates rich people. I made sure of that. Told her that her father was a wealthy man who abandoned her mother, figured it was safer if she never trusted anyone with money and power." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 21 years settling between them like a stone. "She doesn't know," Richard said finally. "No, and if you have any decency left in you, you'll keep it that way. Grace has a good life. She's happy, she's safe, and she doesn't need the complication of a father who couldn't protect her mother." But as Martha drove away, leaving Richard alone with the truth, he couldn't shake the image of Grace's green eyes, Emily's eyes, looking at him across that parking lot. He'd found his daughter, alive and strong and beautiful. Now he had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. Vanessa Corbin stared at her phone in Richard's empty office, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany desk. 3 days. He'd been gone for 3 days without a proper explanation, missing crucial meetings and leaving her to field increasingly irritated calls from clients. But it wasn't the business implications that had her stomach twisted in knots. It was the way Richard had sounded during their last conversation. Distant, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely, or with someone else. She'd been his secretary for 5 years, his lover for 2, and she knew Richard Halbrook better than anyone. This wasn't about business. This was personal. Find out everything you can about Richard's activities in Texas, she told the private investigator over the phone. Her voice crisp and professional. I want to know where he's been, who he's talked to, what he's doing down there. Any particular area of focus, Ms. Corbin? Vanessa hesitated. She'd already tried calling the hotels in the area where Richard's credit card had been used, but he wasn't registered under his own name. That level of secrecy meant something. Or someone important. Start with Cedar Creek and see if there are any women involved. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she had to know. Richard had been pulling away for months, becoming more withdrawn, more haunted by whatever ghosts he carried from his past. She'd thought she was helping him heal, but maybe she'd been fooling herself. Meanwhile, Brandon Halbrook sat in the Morrison client's conference room, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. He'd handled the signing competently enough. Years of watching his father work had taught him the basics, but every few minutes his mind drifted to that strange phone call. Something was wrong with his father. Really wrong. In 35 years, Brandon had never heard Richard sound so. Lost after the meeting, Brandon found himself driving toward the family cemetery where Emily was buried. He'd only been 14 when she died, but he remembered how she'd tried to bridge the gap between him and his father. Emily had been pregnant with what would have been Brandon's half-sister, and for a brief, shining moment, they'd felt like a real family. Then came the accident, and Richard had retreated so far into himself that Brandon sometimes wondered if his father even remembered he existed, standing at Emily's grave. Brandon pulled out his phone and tried calling Richard again, straight to voicemail. Dad, it's me. Look, I know we haven't been close, but whatever's going on, you don't have to handle it alone. Call me back, 300 miles away. Richard was sitting in his rental car outside Murphy's gas station, waiting. He'd been coming here every day for the past week, hoping to catch Grace during one of her regular stops. Martha's revelation had changed everything. Grace wasn't just some stranger who happened to whistle Emily's song. She was his daughter, his living, breathing daughter who had Emily's eyes and Emily's spirit. When the 18-wheeler finally pulled into the lot, Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. Grace climbed down from the cab with her usual efficiency, but today she looked tired, worried even. This was his chance. Excuse me, Richard called, approaching her with practiced casualness. You're Grace Linwood, right? I was hoping I could talk to you about a job. Grace looked up from checking her fuel gauge, her green eyes wary. Depends on the job. I need someone to transport construction materials to a site about 2 hours north of here. It's remote, and most of the big companies won't take the contract. It was a lie. Richard had spent the morning setting up a fake construction project, complete with permits and a legitimate business address. He hated deceiving her, but Martha's warnings echoed in his mind. Grace would never trust him if she knew who he really was. What kind of materials? Steel beams? Concrete blocks? That sort of thing. Multiple trips over the next few weeks. Richard pulled out a folded contract. The pay is generous. Grace glanced at the papers, and Richard saw her eyebrows raise at the figure he'd listed. It was twice what she'd normally charge, but he didn't care about the money. Why me? There are plenty of haulers with more experience. I asked around. People say you're reliable, honest. That matters more than experience. Something in her expression softened slightly. Who told you that? Jake Morrison, for one, said you're the best driver in 3 counties. Grace almost smiled at that. Jake's biased. We've been friends since we were kids. More than friends. The question slipped out before Richard could stop himself. Grace's walls went back up immediately. That's not really your business, Mr. Hartwell, Richard lied smoothly. Robert Hartwell. Well, Mr. Hartwell, Jake and I are. Complicated. He's a good man. Maybe too good for someone like me. Someone like you. Someone who doesn't know how to stay in one place for long. Grace closed the fuel cap with more force than necessary. I'll think about your job offer. Give me a day or two. As she walked toward the station to pay for her gas, Richard found himself studying every detail of her movements. She was strong, confident, but there was something fragile underneath. something that reminded him painfully of Emily during those last few months of her pregnancy, when she'd sensed danger, but couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. Inside the station, Grace was having her own moment of confusion. There was something about Robert Hartwell that felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. Maybe it was just his intensity, the way he looked at her like he was trying to memorize her face. "You okay?" "Gracie." Jake appeared at her elbow, having driven over from his shop. "You look rattled." "Just tired. Martha's been acting strange lately, talking about the past and secrets, and now this Hartwell guy wants to hire me for some big job." Jake's expression darkened. "What kind of job?" "Construction transport. Good money, but something feels off about him. Trust your gut. It's usually right." Grace looked through the window at the man still standing by his expensive car. "Jake, can I ask you something? Anything. Why haven't you ever left Cedar Creek? You're smart enough to work anywhere. Make twice what you do here." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Because everything I care about is here." The weight of his words settled between them. Grace had always known Jake loved her, had known it since they were teenagers, but they'd never talked about it directly. She cared about him too, more than she'd ever admitted. But the thought of staying in one place, of building the kind of life Martha kept hinting at, terrified her. "Jake, I know you're not ready to hear it," he said softly. "I know you need to keep moving, keep searching for whatever it is you're looking for. But when you're ready to come home, really come home, I'll be here." Before Grace could respond, Jake was gone, leaving her standing in the gas station with her heart in her throat and more questions than answers. That evening, as Victor Densmore sat in his Dallas penthouse reviewing financial reports, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. "Mr. Densmore, this is Peterson Investigations. You asked us to monitor any inquiries related to the Halbrook accident from 2003. Victor's blood chilled. "And someone's been asking questions. A private investigator hired by Vanessa Corbin. She's looking into Richard Halbrook's activities in Cedar Creek, Texas." Cedar Creek. The name hit Victor like a physical blow. He'd paid Martha Linwood a considerable sum 21 years ago to disappear and keep her mouth shut about what she'd seen that night. Had the old woman finally decided to talk? "I want everything you can find on current residents of Cedar Creek," Victor said, his voice deadly calm. "Especially anyone connected to Dallas Presbyterian Hospital." "Yes." "Sir?" Victor hung up and poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey. He'd thought the past was buried, along with Emily Halbrook and her inconvenient knowledge of his financial indiscretions. But the past, it seemed, had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. He'd dealt with that problem once before. If necessary, he'd deal with it again. Martha Linwood's hands trembled as she pulled the wooden box from beneath her bed. For 21 years, she'd kept Emily's secrets locked away, but time was running out. The pain in her chest had been getting worse, and the episodes of breathlessness were becoming more frequent. Grace deserved to know the truth before it was too late. The box felt heavier than it should have, as Martha carried it to the kitchen table. Inside were the remnants of a life cut short, hospital bracelets, a birth certificate with carefully altered details, and most importantly, the letters Emily had written during her final weeks of pregnancy. Grace found her there an hour later, staring at the opened box like it contained explosives. "Grandma, what's all this?" Martha looked up, and Grace was startled to see tears streaming down the older woman's face. "Sit down, child. It's time you knew about your mother, the real story." Grace's stomach knotted as she took the chair across from Martha. "I thought you said it was too painful to talk about." "It was. It is." Martha picked up a photograph. A young woman with green eyes and a radiant smile, visibly pregnant and laughing at something off camera. "This is Emily Halbrook, your mother." Grace stared at the photograph, seeing her own features reflected in the stranger's face. "Halbrook, but I told you her name was Johnson, because I was protecting you. From him, from them, from the truth that could have gotten you killed." "Killed, Grandma, you're scaring me." Martha handed her one of the letters. The paper was yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear and careful. "Read this." Emily wrote it 3 days before she died. With shaking hands, Grace unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "My dearest baby girl, I know in my heart you're a girl. If you're reading this, It means I'm not there to tell you myself how much I love you. I sing to you every day, my sweet Grace. Yes, I've chosen your name already. Grace means God's blessing, and that's exactly what you are to me and your daddy. I hope you'll forgive me for the world I'm bringing you into. There are dangerous people around us, people who would hurt our family to protect their secrets. Your daddy is a good man, but he trusts the wrong people. I pray that someday he'll understand what Victor really is. If something happens to me, know that every song I sang, every lullaby I hummed, was filled with all the love I have for you, especially Southern Skies. That's our song. Baby girl, I sing it to you every night when you dance in my belly. Listen for it in the wind, and you'll know I'm still with you. All my love, Mama. Grace's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the letter. This can't be real. There are 12 more, Martha said softly. She wrote them every few days, like she knew she was running out of time. But you told me she was abandoned by some rich man. You said, I lied. The admission seemed to age Martha 10 years. Emily wasn't abandoned, Grace. She was murdered. The world tilted sideways. Grace gripped the edge of the table, fighting nausea. Murdered. By Victor Densmore, her husband's business partner. Emily had discovered he was embezzling money from their real estate company. She had documents, proof of his crimes. So he killed her. Grace's mind reeled. And my father, where was he? Martha's expression grew complicated. Richard loved Emily more than life itself, but he was naive, trusted Victor completely. When Emily died, Victor comforted him, helped him through the grief. Richard never suspected his best friend was a murderer. Richard, Grace's voice was barely a whisper. Richard Halbrook. Yes, the gas station. The man with the expensive suit who'd been so interested in her song. The intensity in his eyes when he'd looked at her. Oh God, he was here, a few days ago, asking about me. Martha went white. What did you tell him? Nothing much. But Grandma, he knew about Southern Skies. He asked where I learned it. We have to leave. Martha stood abruptly, then swayed and gripped the table for support. Grandma? Grace caught her arm. You're sick, aren't you? Really sick. Martha nodded reluctantly. Heart condition. I've been managing it. But the stress, finding out he's here. We're not going anywhere. You need to see a doctor. Grace, you don't understand. If Richard found you, then Victor might know too. And Victor won't hesitate to finish what he started 21 years ago. Before Grace could respond, the sound of a car door slamming made them both freeze. Through the kitchen window, they could see Richard walking up the front path, his expression determined. Don't answer it, Martha whispered. But Grace was already moving toward the door, the letters still clutched in her hand. She yanked it open before Richard could knock. You're him, she said, her voice shaking with fury. You're Richard Halbrook. Richard stopped in his tracks, seeing his own eyes staring back at him with Emily's fire. Grace, I can explain. Explain what? How you let your business partner murder my mother. How you've been lying to me since the moment we met. I didn't know about Victor. I swear to you, I had no idea. Get off our property. Grace's voice was deadly quiet. Now. Please, just let me. Now. Richard held up his hands, backing away slowly. Grace, I know you have no reason to trust me. But you're in danger. Victor Densmore is still alive, still powerful, and if he knows you exist, I can take care of myself. Like your mother could. The words came out harsher than Richard intended, but they had the desired effect. Grace stopped advancing on him. Your mother was strong too, Richard continued, his voice breaking. She was brave and beautiful and determined to protect you, but she underestimated Victor, and it cost her everything. Don't make the same mistake. Grace stared at him for a long moment, and Richard could see Emily in every line of her face, the same stubborn tilt of her chin, the same fire in her eyes when she was angry. What do you want from me? She asked finally. I want to know my daughter. I want to protect her. I want 21 years back that I'll never have. Well, you can't have them. Grace's voice was cold. Final. You weren't there when I scraped my knees or had nightmares or wondered why my daddy didn't want me. Martha was. She's the only family I need. Richard felt each word like a physical blow, but he pressed on. At least let me help you, Martha's sick. Anyone can see that. And Victor will never find us. We've been hiding from him for 21 years. Not hiding, waiting. And now that waiting is over, Grace slammed the door in his face. But Richard could hear her crying on the other side. He stood there for a long moment, his heart breaking for all the lost years, all the missed opportunities to be the father she deserved. Inside, Grace leaned against the door and sobbed. Martha's arms came around her, weak but comforting. I know it hurts, baby girl, but he's right about one thing. Victor is dangerous, and if he knows you're alive— Grace pulled back to look at her grandmother. The documents. The proof that Victor killed my mother. Do you still have them? Martha nodded. Emily hid them well. I've kept them safe all these years. Then it's time to use them. Outside, Richard was walking back to his car when his phone rang. Brandon's name flashed on the screen. Dad, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Brandon, I can't talk right now. Dad, listen to me. Something's happening. Vanessa hired a private investigator to follow you. And now there are people asking questions about our family, about Emily. Richard's blood turned to ice. What kind of people? The kind that work for Victor Densmore. Martha's breathing was labored as she sat on the edge of her bed. Grace kneeling beside her with a wooden box between them. The afternoon light streaming through the curtains seemed dimmer somehow, as if even the sun understood the gravity of what was about to be revealed. Grandma, please, you need to rest. No time for rest, child. Martha's voice was weak but determined. If Victor's people are sniffing around, we may not have long. You need to know everything. Grace watched helplessly as Martha struggled to catch her breath. The woman who had raised her, who had been her pillar of strength for 21 years, suddenly looked fragile as spun glass. The night your mother died, Martha began, her words coming in short bursts. I was the supervising nurse in the ER when they brought Emily in. She was barely conscious, but she was fighting to stay alive long enough to save you. Grace's throat tightened. What did she say? That Victor had found out about the documents. She'd been investigating his financial dealings for months, gathering evidence, real estate fraud, money laundering, connections to some very dangerous people. Martha reached into the box with trembling hands. She had it all documented, names, dates, bank records. Where are the documents now? Hidden, in a place Victor would never think to look. Martha's smile was weak but satisfied. Emily was clever. She knew she was being watched, so she made copies and stashed them in 3 different locations. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. And Victor killed her for this. He ran her off the road that night, made it look like an accident. But Emily lived long enough to tell me the truth. Long enough to make me promise to save you. Martha's eyes filled with tears. She died singing Southern Skies, Grace. Singing to you even as the life left her body. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. All those years of humming that melody, feeling connected to something she couldn't name. It had been her mother's last gift, passed through the thin veil between life and death. The birth certificate in the box, Martha continued. It's falsified. I changed the details, made it look like you died 3 hours after birth. Victor had people watching the hospital waiting to make sure there were no loose ends. Grace stared at the yellowed document, seeing her own death recorded in careful handwriting. How did you get me out? Laundry cart. I was scheduled to work a double shift that night, which gave me time to arrange things. I had a friend in the morgue, another nurse who owed me favors. We made it look like your body was processed with the other, with Emily. The weight of 21 years of deception settled on Grace's shoulders, and you've been carrying this secret ever since. Every day, every moment, watching you grow up, knowing that somewhere out there, your father was grieving for a daughter he thought was dead. Grace thought about Richard's eyes at the gas station, the desperate intensity she'd seen there. He really didn't know. Richard Halbrook is many things. Wealthy, powerful, sometimes arrogant, but he's not a killer. He loved Emily with everything in him, and he would have loved you the same way. But Victor was his closest friend, his business partner. Richard trusted him completely. And now Victor knows I'm alive. Martha nodded grimly. If he doesn't already, he will soon. And he won't make the same mistake twice. This time, he'll make sure there's no one left to tell the story. Before Grace could respond, The sound of tires on gravel made them both freeze. Through the window, they could see a black SUV pulling into the driveway, followed by Richard's Mercedes. "It's him," Martha whispered. "Your father. And he's not alone." Grace watched as Richard climbed out of his car, followed by a younger man who shared his facial features. Her half-brother, she realized with a start, Brandon. But it was the men emerging from the SUV that made her blood run cold. Two figures in expensive suits, moving with the predatory grace of professional killers. "Back door!" Martha gasped, struggling to stand. "Take the box. Go to Jake's shop. He'll know what to do." "I'm not leaving you. You have to. If they find those documents..." The front door exploded inward with a thunderous crash. Grace grabbed the wooden box in Martha's arm, helping the older woman toward the kitchen as heavy footsteps echoed through the house. "Mrs. Linwood," a cold voice called out. "We'd like to have a conversation." Grace recognized the voice from Martha's descriptions. Smooth, cultured, with an underlying current of violence, Victor Densmore had come calling after 21 years. They made it to the kitchen before Victor appeared in the doorway, flanked by his men. He was older than Grace had expected, silver-haired and distinguished, but his eyes were the flat, emotionless gray of a shark's. Well, Victor said, his gaze moving between Martha and Grace. "The famous Martha Linwood and her granddaughter, is it? What do you want?" Martha's voice was steady despite her obvious fear. "What I've always wanted to tie up loose ends." Victor's smile was predatory. "You've been very clever, Martha. Disappearing all those years ago, keeping your mouth shut. I almost forgot about you. Almost. Until my old friend Richard started sniffing around, asking questions about the past. Amazing how grief can make a man sentimental, isn't it?" Grace felt rage building in her chest. This was the man who had murdered her mother, who had torn apart her family before she'd even been born. "You killed her," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "You killed Emily." Victor's expression didn't change. Emily Halbrook was a naive little girl who stuck her nose where it didn't belong. She could have lived a comfortable life, raised her baby, been the perfect society wife. Instead, she chose to play detective. She chose to expose a criminal. She chose to threaten my livelihood, my freedom, my future. Victor stepped closer, and Grace could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something darker, the scent of a man who'd spilled blood and slept soundly afterward. "Just like you're threatening it now." "The documents," Martha said suddenly. "That's what you really want, isn't it? Emily's evidence." "Among other things, you see, Martha, I've spent 21 years building an empire on the foundation of that night. Richard's grief made him easy to manipulate, easy to control, but now he's found his precious daughter, and sentiment is making him unpredictable." Grace's mind raced. "Richard doesn't know you're here. Richard thinks I'm in Dallas on business. By the time he realizes what's happened, you and Martha will have suffered a tragic accident. Gas leak, perhaps. These old houses are so dangerous." One of Victor's men moved toward the stove, and Grace realized with horror that they'd planned this out in detail. Martha grabbed her arm, squeezing tight. "The star," Martha whispered, so quietly only Grace could hear. "Show him the star." Grace looked down at her left wrist, where a small, star-shaped birthmark had always sat just below her palm. Emily had written about it in one of her letters, a family trait that had skipped Richard but appeared in Grace. "You want proof." Grace held up her wrist. "Richard will know this mark. He'll know I'm Emily's daughter. And when he figures out what really happened that night..." Victor's composure cracked for the first time. Clever girl. Emily was clever too. Look how well that worked out for her. Outside, the sound of car doors slamming echoed across the property. Victor's head turned toward the window, and Grace saw a flicker of concern cross his features. "Expecting company?" he asked Martha. Before anyone could answer, Jake's voice boomed from the front yard. "Grace, you in there? Your truck's here, but..." The kitchen window exploded inward as Jake dove through it, landing hard on the linoleum and rolling to his feet. He took in the scene. Victor's men, Martha's terrified face, Grace clutching the wooden box, and his expression turned thunderous. "Well," Victor said mildly, "this is becoming quite the reunion." Jake's eyes never left Victor's face. "You must be the son of a bitch who's been asking questions about Grace." "Among other things," Victor nodded to his men. Kill them all. Make it look like a break-in gone wrong. But as his men reached for their weapons, Richard's voice cut through the tension like a blade. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Victor. Everyone turned to see Richard standing in the kitchen doorway, Brandon behind him, both men holding guns with the steady confidence of people who knew how to use them. Hello, old friend, Victor said, his voice carrying no surprise. I was wondering when you'd show up. Put your hands where I can see them, Victor. All of you. You're making a mistake, Richard. These people have been lying to you for 21 years. The only liar in this room is you. Richard's voice was deadly calm. I know what you did to Emily. I know what you've been doing to our company. And I know that Grace is my daughter. Grace watched this confrontation between the two men who had shaped her life without her knowledge. One who had unknowingly abandoned her. The other who had tried to kill her before she'd taken her first breath. Daddy, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop it. Richard's gun never wavered, but his eyes found hers across the room. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere this time. The standoff in Martha's kitchen stretched like a taut wire, everyone frozen in a deadly tableau. Victor's men had their hands halfway to their weapons when Richard's voice cut through the tension again. Brandon, call the sheriff. Tell him we need immediate backup at the Linwood property. Already on it. Dad. Brandon held up his phone, finger poised over the screen. One word from you. Victor's laugh was cold and bitter. The sheriff, really, Richard. You think local law enforcement can touch me? I have federal connections. Judges in my pocket. Senators who owe me favors. Maybe. But you're forgetting something important. Richard's grip on his gun remained steady. I have 21 years of pent-up rage and nothing left to lose. Grace watched this confrontation between the two men who had defined her existence, feeling like she was witnessing the final act of a play that had been running since before her birth. But it was Jake's quiet movement that caught her attention. He was slowly positioning himself between her and Victor's men, ready to throw himself into harm's way. Jake, don't, she whispered. Not happening, Gracie. I told you I'd protect you, and I meant it. Martha's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, the stress of the situation taking its toll on her weakened heart. Grace knelt beside her, one hand still clutching the wooden box that contained Emily's secrets. The documents, Martha gasped. Victor, he can't get them. He won't, Grace promised. I won't let him. Victor's attention shifted to the box in Grace's hands. What touching family loyalty. Emily had the same misguided sense of justice. It got her killed. No, Richard said, his voice deadly quiet. You got her killed, because you're a coward who preferred murder to facing the consequences of your crimes. I'm a survivor. Richard, something you never understood. You were always too soft, too trusting, too willing to believe the best in people, including you. God help me, including you. Brandon stepped forward, his own weapon trained on Victor's men. Dad, we need to end this. Martha needs medical attention. It was true. Martha's lips were taking on a bluish tinge, and her breathing was becoming more shallow by the minute. Grace felt panic rising in her throat. She couldn't lose Martha. Not now. Not when she'd finally learned the truth about her mother. Victor, Richard said, this is over. Your men put down their weapons, and we can discuss this like civilized people. Civilized? Victor's mask of composure finally slipped completely. There's nothing civilized about what you're proposing, Richard. You want to destroy everything I've built, everything I've worked for. For what? A dead woman and a bastard child who should have died 21 years ago. The words hit Grace like physical blows. But it was Richard's reaction that truly shocked her. She'd never seen fury transform a person so completely. Her father's face went white with rage, and for a moment, she thought he might actually pull the trigger. That bastard child, Richard said, his voice barely controlled, is my daughter, Emily's daughter, and she's worth more than your pathetic criminal empire. It was the first time Richard had truly claimed her. And despite everything, the guns, the danger, Martha's failing health, Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest. How touching, Victor sneered. The great Richard Halbrook, finally growing a spine. Too bad it's 21 years too late. You're right about one thing, Richard said. I should have seen through you years ago. Should have questioned the convenient timing of Emily's death. should have demanded more answers, but I was drowning in grief, and you were right there, offering comfort and support. I saved your sanity, Richard, gave you something to focus on besides your loss. You manipulated my grief to cover your crimes, used my pain as a shield for your guilt. Jake had been quietly assessing the situation, and Grace could see him calculating angles, distances, possibilities. He caught her eye and mouthed a single word: duck. But before anyone could move, Martha made a sound that was part gasp, part sob. Her hand went to her chest, and her face contorted in pain. "Grandma!" Grace dropped the box and caught Martha as she collapsed. The moment of distraction was all Victor needed. He lunged for the wooden box while his men went for their guns, but Brandon was faster, tackling one of Victor's thugs while Richard spun toward Victor himself. Jake dove across the kitchen, knocking Grace and Martha behind the counter just as gunshots erupted. The old house filled with the deafening crack of weapons fire, splintering wood and breaking glass. "Stay down," Jake shouted over the chaos, his body shielding both women from the violence erupting around them. Grace held Martha's barely conscious form while the battle raged above them. Through the cabinet doors, she could see Richard and Brandon moving with surprising coordination, working together like they'd been planning this for years instead of hours. Victor had managed to grab the wooden box, but Richard was on him immediately. The two men crashed into the kitchen table, scattering Emily's letters and photographs across the floor like fallen leaves. 21 years, Richard snarled as they grappled. 21 years you let me believe my daughter was dead. She should have been dead, Victor gasped back. If Martha hadn't interfered, Richard's fist connected with Victor's jaw with a crack that was audible even over the gunfire. Victor stumbled backward, blood streaming from his mouth, but he wasn't finished. "You think this changes anything?" Victor spat. "You think finding your precious daughter gives you some kind of moral victory? She's still just a truck driver from nowhere, and you're still the fool who trusted the wrong man." "Maybe," Richard said, advancing on him again. "But at least I'm not the monster who murdered a pregnant woman." The fight between the two men was brutal and personal. 21 years of buried truth erupting in violence. But it was Brandon who ended it, appearing behind Victor with his gun pressed to the man's temple. "It's over," Brandon said quietly. "Dad, it's over." Victor's remaining man, the other had been subdued by Jake, slowly raised his hands. The kitchen fell silent, except for Martha's labored breathing and the distant sound of approaching sirens. Grace emerged from behind the counter, her arms still supporting Martha. "We need an ambulance." "Now? Already called," Brandon said, not taking his gun off Victor. "They're 3 minutes out." Richard knelt beside the scattered photographs, gathering up the images of Emily with hands that trembled slightly. When he looked up at Grace, she could see 21 years of grief and regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for all of it. For not protecting your mother, for not finding you sooner, for every birthday and Christmas and scraped knee I missed." Grace looked at this man who was a stranger and her father all at once. "You couldn't have known. I should have known. A father should know when his child is in danger. But you're here now," Grace said softly. "When it mattered most, you're here." Martha stirred in her arms, her eyes fluttering open. "Grace, is it over?" "It's over, Grandma. Victor can't hurt anyone anymore." Martha's gaze found Richard across the room. You came for her?" "I came for both of you," Richard said. "I should have done it 21 years ago." As the sound of sirens grew louder, Jake helped Grace get Martha to a more comfortable position. "Ambulance is almost here," he said. "She's going to be okay." Grace looked around the destroyed kitchen, at Richard gathering up her mother's letters, at Brandon keeping watch over Victor, at Jake who had risked his life to protect her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged to something larger than herself. "Jake," she said quietly. "Yeah, earlier, when you said you'd be here when I was ready to come home, did you mean it?" Jake's smile was answer enough. Outside, red and blue lights painted the Texas sky, and Grace could hear voices shouting orders. The past was finally catching up with the present, and somehow, against all odds, it looked like there might be hope for a future after all. 3 weeks later, Grace was making what she thought would be a routine delivery to the Henderson ranch. 40 miles northeast of Cedar Creek. Martha was recovering slowly but steadily at the county hospital, and for the first time in years, Grace felt something approaching peace. Richard had been visiting daily, tentatively building bridges across 21 years of separation. They were taking it slow. Too much had happened for instant forgiveness. But Grace was beginning to see glimpses of the man her mother had loved. Victor was in federal custody, facing charges that would put him away for life. The documents Martha had hidden for 21 years had proven even more damaging than Emily could have imagined. Victor's criminal enterprise had grown far beyond simple embezzlement into money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy charges that reached into the highest levels of government. Grace should have felt safe, should have known better. She was 15 miles from the Henderson Ranch, driving through the most isolated stretch of Texas highway. When she noticed the black sedan in her rearview mirror, it had been following her for the last 10 miles, maintaining a careful distance but never falling back or pulling ahead. Her cob crackled to life. "Grace, you copy." Jake's voice filled the cab. "I'm here, Jake. What's up? Where are you right now?" Something in his tone made her sit up straighter. "About 15 miles out from Henderson's." "Why?" "I just got a call from the sheriff's office. Victor made bail this morning." Grace's blood turned to ice. "What? How is that possible?" "Apparently, he has friends in very high places. Federal judge in Dallas signed the order 2 hours ago." Grace's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she checked her mirrors again. The black sedan was still there, and now she could see a second vehicle, a dark SUV, approaching from the front. "Jake, I think I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind with 4 wheels and bad intentions." Grace downshifted and pressed the accelerator. But 18-wheelers weren't built for speed. The sedan behind her was gaining ground, and the SUV ahead was positioning itself for a roadblock. "Grace, listen to me." Jake's voice was tight with urgency. "You remember the old bridge over Carpenter's Creek? The one we used to fish from when we were kids?" "Yeah, but Jake, that's where your mother died. Victor's going to try to finish what he started 21 years ago." The realization hit Grace like a physical blow. Victor hadn't just made bail. He'd planned this. Planned to recreate Emily's death down to the smallest detail, completing the circle of violence that had started before Grace was born. The sedan was close enough now that Grace could see the driver's face in her side mirror. It wasn't Victor. He was too smart to get his own hands dirty. But the man behind the wheel had the cold, professional look of someone who killed for money. "Jake, call Richard, call Brandon, call everybody. Already done. They're on their way. But Grace, they're 20 minutes out. Maybe more. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Grace could see the old bridge ahead, its rusted steel framework spanning Carpenter's Creek, like the skeleton of some ancient beast. The SUV had stopped sideways across the road just before the bridge approach, forcing her to slow down. Her cob crackled again, but this time it wasn't Jake's voice. "Miss Linwood." Victor's cultured tones filled the cab, and Grace felt her skin crawl. "I believe we have some unfinished business." "Go to hell, Victor. I'm afraid hell will have to wait. You see, my federal friends are only going to keep me out of prison for so long. Something about maintaining plausible deniability. So I need to clean house before I disappear permanently." Grace was down to 30 miles per hour now, the SUV looming larger in her windshield. Behind her, the sedan had closed to within 10 feet. She was trapped between them, just like her mother had been trapped between Victor's car and the guardrail 21 years ago. "You killed my mother for nothing," Grace said into the CB. "She was trying to protect people from you. Your mother was naive. She thought the world operated on principles of right and wrong, good and evil. But the world operates on power, Miss Linwood. Nothing more, nothing less." Grace could see armed men emerging from the SUV, professional killers, just like the ones who had come to Martha's house. But this time, there would be no last-minute rescue. This time, Victor had planned for every contingency. "Jake," she whispered into her keep, "if something happens to me..." "Nothing's going to happen to you, Gracie, you hear me? Nothing." But even as Jake spoke, Grace could see the trap closing around her. The sedan behind her was accelerating, preparing to ram her trailer and send her tumbling off the bridge just like Emily's car had tumbled all those years ago. She had maybe 30 seconds before impact. That's when Grace remembered something Jake had taught her years ago, back when they were teenagers and he was showing off his mechanical knowledge. Every truck had weak points, places where the right pressure applied at the right moment could cause catastrophic failure. Grace downshifted hard, feeling the engine brake engage. The sudden deceleration caught the sedan driver off guard, and he had to swerve to avoid rear-ending her trailer. But that wasn't Grace's plan. She yanked the wheel hard to the right, feeling the trailer start to jackknife. For a terrifying moment, she thought she'd miscalculated. The whole rig was sliding toward the guardrail, toward the same fate that had claimed her mother. But Grace had grown up around trucks, had learned to drive on these same roads that Jake knew like the back of his hand. She corrected the slide at the last possible second, using the trailer's momentum to swing the rear end around like a massive weapon. 20,000 pounds of steel and cargo caught the sedan's front end like a sledgehammer. The car crumpled instantly, its driver crushed before he could even scream. But Grace's victory was short-lived. The SUV's occupants were already moving, surrounding her cab with military precision. She could see rifle barrels pointing at her through the windshield, laser sights painting red dots across her chest. "Very impressive, Miss Linwood." Victor's voice crackled through the CB again. "Your mother never showed such resourcefulness, but I'm afraid this is where your luck runs out." Grace reached for the door handle, but one of the gunmen shook his head. The message was clear. "Stay in the cab, and maybe you'll live a few minutes longer." Through her side mirror, Grace could see dust clouds on the horizon. Someone was coming fast, but they were still too far away to help, Jake had said. Richard and Brandon were 20 minutes out. That was 15 minutes ago, but it felt like a lifetime. "Victor," Grace said into the CB, "you want to kill me? Fine, but let's do this face to face like men." Victor's laugh was cold and amused. "My dear child, I'm not going to kill you. That would be too quick, too merciful. I'm going to recreate your mother's accident down to the smallest detail. You're going to die exactly the way she died, in exactly the same place. And then what? You disappear to some non-extradition country and live happily ever after. Something like that. I have considerable resources at my disposal, and very few scruples about how I use them." One of the gunmen was approaching the cab now, his rifle trained on Grace's head. Through the windshield, she could see Victor's men positioning charges on the bridge supports. They weren't just planning to push her off. They were going to bring down the entire structure, making it look like a catastrophic structural failure. Grace closed her eyes and thought about Emily, about the mother she'd never known who had died singing Southern Skies to her unborn daughter, about Martha, who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe, about Richard, who was racing through the Texas countryside trying to save the daughter he'd already lost once, and about Jake, whose voice was still crackling through the Seeb, talking her through the terror with the same steady presence he'd shown their entire lives. "Gracie, can you hear me? I'm here, Jake. I need you to listen very carefully. Help is coming, but you need to buy us some time." "How?" "Trust me and remember, sometimes the best way out is through." Grace opened her eyes and saw the gunman reaching for her door handle. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of approaching engines. Richard and Brandon were coming, but they might be too late. Victor's voice filled the cab one last time. "Goodbye, Miss Linwood. Give my regards to your mother." The gunman's hand was inches from Grace's door handle when the sound of roaring engines filled the air. But it wasn't coming from the road. It was coming from the creek bed below the bridge. Jake's pickup truck burst through the underbrush like a mechanical wild animal, airborne for a heart-stopping moment before crashing down on the creek bank. Behind him came Richard's Mercedes and Brandon's Range Rover, both vehicles sliding to stops in clouds of dust and gravel. "What the hell?" one of Victor's men started to say, but Jake was already moving. He'd spent his entire life on these roads, knew every shortcut, every hunting trail, every path through the wilderness that surrounded Carpenter's Creek, while Victor's men had been focused on the bridge approach. Jake had used the old logging road that paralleled the creek, the same route he and Grace had used as kids when they wanted to avoid the main highway. Jake rolled out of his truck with a hunting rifle in his hands, taking cover behind the concrete bridge supports. "Grace, get down!" The gunman at Grace's door spun toward this new threat, but Grace was already moving. She slammed the truck door open, catching him in the chest and sending him stumbling backward. His rifle went off, the bullet shattering her passenger side window, but Grace was already diving toward the cab's sleeper compartment. "Kill them all!" Victor's voice screamed through the sub. "Kill them all and blow the bridge!" Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Richard and Brandon took positions behind their vehicles, returning fire with the precision of men who'd spent considerable time at shooting ranges. But Victor's men had superior numbers and professional training. Jake worked his way along the creek bank, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay hidden. Every rock, every tree, every depression in the ground was familiar territory. He'd hunted these woods since he was 12 years old, and now that knowledge was the only thing standing between Grace and death. "Grace," he called out. "Can you get to the trailer?" "I think so." Grace's voice was tight with fear but steady. "What do you need me to do?" "The air brake release. Can you reach it from the cab?" Grace understood immediately. Jake wanted her to release the trailer's brakes, turning 20,000 pounds of cargo into a massive projectile. It was insane, brilliant, and possibly suicidal all at once. "Jake, if I miss, you won't miss. You're the best driver I know." One of Victor's men was climbing onto the truck's running board, trying to get a clear shot at Grace through the windshield. She grabbed the Saab handset and swung it like a club, catching him across the temple. He fell backward, his rifle clattering to the asphalt. Grace reached for the air brake release, but another gunman appeared at her side window. Time slowed to a crawl as she saw his finger tighten on the trigger. The shot that followed was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the cab, but it wasn't Grace who screamed. Brandon had put a bullet through the gunman's shoulder, spinning him away from the truck. "Grace, now!" Jake's voice cut through the chaos. Grace pulled the air brake release and felt the trailer lurch as 20,000 pounds of construction materials began rolling backward down the slight incline of the bridge approach. Victor's remaining men scattered as the massive trailer bore down on their position, but Victor himself was nowhere to be seen. Richard had worked his way around to the far side of the bridge, using the confusion of the trailer's movement to flank Victor's position. He found his former business partner crouched behind the SUV, frantically trying to activate what looked like a remote detonator. "Going somewhere, Victor?" Victor looked up, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You're too late, Richard. The charges are already set. In 30 seconds, this whole bridge comes down. Then we'd better settle this quickly." The two men who had once been closer than brothers faced each other across 21 years of lies and betrayal. Victor still held the detonator, his thumb hovering over the activation switch. "You could have had everything," Victor said. "Money, power, respect. Instead, you chose to mourn a dead woman and chase fantasies about a daughter who should never have survived. Emily wasn't a fantasy. And Grace isn't either. Grace is a mistake that I'm about to correct." Victor's thumb started to press down on the detonator, but Richard was faster. 21 years of grief and rage exploded in a single, devastating punch that caught Victor in the throat. The detonator flew from his hands, skittering across the asphalt. Both men dove for it, but Richard was younger, stronger, and motivated by more than just self-preservation. He reached the device first, but Victor grabbed his ankle, sending them both sprawling. Meanwhile, Jake had worked his way up to the bridge deck, but one of Victor's men had spotted him. The gunman's rifle was trained on Jake's chest when Grace's voice cut through the air. "Hey, over here." The gunman turned toward her voice, and that moment of distraction was all Jake needed. His own rifle spoke once, and Victor's man crumpled to the asphalt. But the effort had exposed Jake's position. Another gunman, hidden behind the bridge's steel framework, had a clear shot at him now. Grace saw the rifle barrel swinging toward Jake and didn't think. She just acted. She threw herself out of the truck cab, covering the distance to Jake in 3 desperate strides. The gunman's shot took her in the shoulder, spinning her around, but her momentum carried her into Jake, knocking him behind the relative safety of the bridge supports. "Grace! Jesus, Grace!" Jake's hands were immediately on her wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "I'm okay," she gasped, though blood was seeping between Jake's fingers. Just a scratch. Like hell, it's just a scratch." The gunfire was tapering off now. Brandon had eliminated the last of Victor's men. And Richard had Victor pinned against the SUV, the detonator crushed beneath Richard's boot. "It's over," Richard panted. 21 years. "Victor, it's finally over." Victor's laugh was broken, bitter. "You think this ends anything? You think you can just walk away and play happy family? That's exactly what I think. Emily's still dead. Richard, she's still dead, and nothing you do will bring her back. No, Richard said quietly. "But Grace is alive. Grace is alive. And that's Emily's real victory. She saved our daughter, Victor. Even dying, she found a way to save our daughter." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Real law enforcement this time. Not Victor's paid thugs, sheriff's deputies, federal agents. Ambulance's help was finally coming. Jake had managed to stop Grace's bleeding, but she was pale and shaky from blood loss. "Stay with me, Gracie," he murmured. "Help's almost here." "Jake," Grace whispered. "Yeah, when I get out of the hospital. Ask me again." "Ask you what?" Grace's smile was weak but genuine. "You know what?" As the ambulance crew worked on Grace, loading her onto a stretcher, Richard approached Jake. The young man's clothes were soaked with Grace's blood, and his hands shook with residual adrenaline. "Thank you," Richard said simply, "for protecting her, for loving her." Jake looked at this wealthy, powerful man who was his beloved's father. "She's worth protecting." "Yes, she is." As the ambulance pulled away with Grace inside, Jake following in his battered pickup truck, Richard stood on the bridge where Emily had died 21 years ago. The structure was scarred by gunfire now, marked by violence, but it was still standing, just like his family. 3 months later, the morning sun painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and amber as Grace stood before the mirror in Martha's old bedroom, adjusting the simple white dress that had belonged to her grandmother. It wasn't fancy, just cotton and lace with pearl buttons, but it had been worn by 3 generations of women who had loved deeply and sacrificed everything for family. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." Richard's reflection appeared behind hers in the mirror, and Grace was struck by how much he'd changed in the past few months. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by something she'd never seen before: peace. "I wish she could be here," Grace said softly, her fingers tracing the delicate embroidery on the dress's collar. "She is here, in every choice you've made, every person you've helped, every mile you've driven to make someone's life better." Richard's hands settled gently on her shoulders. "Martha would be so proud of the woman you've become." Grace smiled. Remembering Martha's final weeks, the old woman had rallied enough to see Victor sentenced to life in prison, had held Grace's hand during the long nights in the hospital, had whispered stories about Emily that painted a picture of a mother Grace could finally grieve and celebrate. Martha had died peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks ago, surrounded by the family she'd created and protected for 21 years. Her last words had been about the wedding. "Make sure that boy knows what a treasure he's getting." "Are you ready?" Richard asked. Grace nodded, then paused. "Dad, can I ask you something?" The word still felt new in her mouth, but Richard's face lit up every time she said it. "Anything. Do you think Mom would have liked Jake?" Richard's smile was soft with memory. Emily would have loved Jake. She always said the measure of a man wasn't in his wallet or his title, but in how he treated the people who couldn't do anything for him. Jake's been taking care of half the county for years without expecting anything in return. She would have known he was perfect for you within 5 minutes, even though he's not wealthy or powerful. Especially because he's not wealthy or powerful. Emily never cared about money, Grace. She cared about character. Outside, the sound of cars arriving in the gravel driveway signaled that it was time. The wedding was small. Just family and close friends gathered in Martha's garden, where wildflowers bloomed among the herbs, and the air smelled of lavender and possibility. Grace and Richard walked down the garden path together, and she could see the years they'd lost, reflected in every face that turned toward them. Brandon stood beside Jake at the makeshift altar, both men looking nervous and proud. The sheriff was there, along with half the town of Cedar Creek, people whose lives Grace had touched during her years on the road, but it was Jake's expression that made Grace's heart skip. He stood beneath an arch of native Texas roses, wearing his best suit, and a smile that could have powered the whole county. This man who had loved her since childhood, who had risked his life to save her, who had never asked for anything more than the chance to stand beside her. "Who gives this woman to be married?" asked the minister, a kind-faced man who had baptized both Grace and Jake in Carpenter's Creek 20 years ago. "I do," Richard said, his voice strong and clear. "As her father, with all the love I should have been able to give her from the beginning." He placed Grace's hand in Jake's, and for a moment, the 3 of them stood connected by more than just ceremony. They were connected by love, by sacrifice, by the understanding that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who chose to stand by you when the world fell apart. "Jake," the minister continued, "do you take Grace to be your wife, to love and cherish, in good times and bad, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been waiting my whole life to say those words." "And Grace, do you take Jake to be your husband, to love and cherish, in good times and bad, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live?" Grace looked into Jake's honest brown eyes and saw their future spread out like the Texas highways she'd driven for so many years. There would be long hauls and short trips, good weather and storms, but they would face it all together. "I do," she said, "always." As Jake slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Grace felt something settle in her chest, a sense of coming home that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with love. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and Jake needed no further encouragement. The kiss was sweet and sure, witnessed by everyone who mattered, blessed by a Texas sky that stretched endless and blue above them. When they broke apart, the garden erupted in cheers and applause. But it was what happened next that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. Richard began to whistle, softly at first, then stronger. The melody was familiar, heartbreaking, beautiful. "Southern Skies," Brandon joined in, having learned the song from Grace during their long conversations about Emily. Then Jake, who had heard Grace hum it 1,000 times during their childhood. Soon, the entire gathering was whistling or humming along, the melody rising into the Texas air like a prayer. Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she added her own voice to the chorus. The same song her mother had sung to her before birth, the same melody that had brought her father back to her after 21 years. In that moment, Grace could swear she felt Emily's presence, as real as the warm breeze that rustled through Martha's herb garden. Her mother was there, in the music, in the love that surrounded her daughter on the most important day of her life. 6 months later, Grace stood on the porch of the house she and Jake had built together, her hand resting on her growing belly. The baby was due in spring, and already she could feel the little one moving when she sang, just like Emily had described in her letters. Richard visited every weekend now. His relationship with both Grace and Brandon stronger than it had ever been. Brandon had taken over much of the day-to-day operations of the business, freeing Richard to spend time with the family he'd nearly lost forever. Vanessa had moved to California, accepting a generous severance package and a promise to never speak about the events that had brought the Halbrook family back together. She'd seemed almost relieved to go, understanding that she'd never been more than a placeholder in Richard's heart. Grace still drove truck, though she'd cut back to local routes since the pregnancy. Jake worried, but he understood that the road was part of who she was. She'd inherited Martha's house and her father's business sense, but most importantly, she'd inherited Emily's strength and capacity for love. As the sun set over the Texas countryside, painting the sky in familiar shades of amber and gold, Grace began to whistle. "Southern Skies." The melody drifted across the fields, carrying with it all the love and loss and hope of the past 21 years. Inside her womb, the baby stirred, already learning the song that would connect her to a grandmother she'd never meet but whose love would follow her forever. Some melodies, Grace thought, are too strong to die. They just wait for the right voice to carry them home. And somewhere in the evening breeze, Emily Halbrook smiled and sang along,